Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to lead you quietly through the sands of time where the golden sun of ancient Egypt never sets and the secrets of kings are whispered by the wind. This is not the story you learned in school. No triumphal marches or grand parades beneath marble columns. No, this is the hidden tale, the quieter, more haunting life behind the mask of the pharaoh. So get comfortable, let your breath slow, your shoulders soften, close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin. Long ago, beside the slow-moving waters of the Nile, where reeds rustled like silk and time clung to the stone walls of temples, a child was born under a sky soaked in stars. His name was Nebmaat. The midwives whispered the name as they swaddled him in linen, his body small and quiet, but his fate already writ in ink and ash. For Nebmaat was to be Pharaoh, divine ruler, walking god, chosen of the sun. From his first breath, the palace walls held him close and far all at once. He was not raised by his mother, but by appointed wet nurses and stern-eyed tutors, each a spoke in the great turning wheel of dynastic duty. The high priest declared him sacred, untouched by common hands. He was forbidden from walking barefoot on plain earth. Even his toys were carved from ebony and gold, small replicas of the real power he would one day hold. But the nursery of a pharaoh was not a place of warmth. Each lullaby sung to Nebmaat was laced with expectation. Each petal of kindness came with the weight of lineage. Even as a child, he was taught to sit in silence, to gaze without blinking, to nod solemnly when the elders spoke of his future. He learned of the gods, how Ra pulled the sun across the sky, how Osiris ruled the underworld, how Ma'at balanced truth against the chaos that slithered at the world's edge. And he learned too that he was not merely a boy. He was Horus in the flesh, anointed, eternal. This knowledge, given so young, sank into his marrow like a quiet sickness. In the mornings, before the desert heat painted everything in white glare, Nebmaat was led through the palace gardens. The date palms offered sparse shade, and the lotus ponds reflected his image back to him, small, serious, alone. The servants kept their distance, eyes lowered, mouths tight. He could see their fear, not of him precisely, but of the idea of him, the living god. It was during these early walks that he began to feel it, the disturbing quiet that came not from peace but from isolation. No playmates, no laughter, no mother's embrace, only ritual and silence and the smell of stone warmed by sun. When he turned 10, a new chamberlain arrived, an old man with hands like woven papyrus and a voice low as thunder wrapped in silk. His name was Khemwaset, and he had served under 3 pharaohs already. His presence was different. He did not tremble when he looked at Nebmaat. He did not speak in riddles. He knelt when he must, but never for long. A god may be eternal, he said one morning as he combed the boy's hair, but even the gods have hearts that can crack like clay pots. Nebmaat didn't understand then, not fully. But he remembered those words. By 13, his face was carved in statues across the land. He'd never ridden a boat alone, nor spoken to a child his own age. Yet he was already more image than boy. The artisans shaped his brow to look serene, his posture to appear unyielding. His every gesture rehearsed before the court, how to raise his hand, how to speak with measured cadence, how to look upon a crowd and not seem overwhelmed. And still there was the loneliness, vast and coiling. At night he would sit upon the roof of the palace where the cool breeze stirred his linen robes and the stars whispered stories to the patient. He wondered if the gods ever felt tired, if Ra ever wanted to stop pulling the sun, if Osiris resting in the Duat ever longed to rise again and walk among men unburdened. The scribes say that the life of a pharaoh was filled with divine joy, with endless feasts and acolytes fanning him beneath alabaster columns. But they did not see the darkness between those golden days, the way every meal was tasted first by a servant in case of poison, the way his bed was surrounded each night by guards who never spoke, never blinked, the way he could not touch another without them trembling. When he reached 15, the great priests began whispering of marriage, for a pharaoh must have a queen and heirs, and a perfect reflection of the gods' harmony. The court women were brought forth like offerings, painted, perfumed, silent. But Nebmaat did not want any of them. Not because they were unworthy, but because they were strangers, chosen not for love or laughter, but for bloodline and obedience. In his heart he longed not for a queen, but for freedom, to sit by the river without guards, to speak plainly, to be held without ceremony. He found moments of peace only with Kenwaset. The old man would bring him stories from before the dynasty, tales of forgotten pharaohs, of cities swallowed by sand, of kings who ruled not from palaces but from boats that drifted with the reeds. Nebmaat listened, wide-eyed, imagining himself not as a god, but as a traveller, a storyteller, a boy who could vanish into the desert and leave the gold behind. But even dreams were taxed in the palace. One day, as the court gathered to perform a ritual offering to Amun-Ra, a servant girl dropped a jar of unguent. It shattered. The silence that followed was thick with dread. She fell to her knees weeping, hands outstretched in apology. Nebmaat looked down at her, no older than himself, hair braided with care, eyes red from fear. The priest beside him leaned close and whispered, "She must be punished, the gods are watching." Nebmaat stood still for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "The gods know mercy." He turned and walked away. Behind him, the court gasped. The girl was spared, but the priest scowled. That night, Kenwaset sat beside him, eyes heavy. "You've changed something," the old man murmured. "Even a small crack can shift the shape of a wall." Nebmaat said nothing, but in his chest something stirred. Not rebellion, not quite. Just a hunger for something real, something outside the mask. And so the life of a pharaoh began, not with conquest, not with glory, but with silence, and the weight of a crown no child could truly bear. In the cool hush of early morning, long before the sun crested over the eastern dunes, Nebmaat would often awaken not to the sound of birdsong or rustling leaves, but to the quiet shuffle of servants preparing his garments, the soft clinking of gold bracelets being arranged, and the hushed whispers that filled the air like incense smoke. There was no room for sleepiness in the chamber of a living god. A pharaoh must greet the day not as a man, but as an emblem of the divine. He was 16 now, with eyes that had begun to see too much, and a voice that had deepened into something that made even seasoned priests listen carefully. Still, he was young, and although the throne beneath him was carved from granite and crowned with sacred symbols, his heart remained soft in places the court would never dare to inspect. Each morning, the rituals demanded their due. First, he was bathed in sacred waters gathered from the Nile at the break of dawn. Then perfumed oils were rubbed into his skin, myrrh, lotus and frankincense, until the scent clung to him like memory. His hair, now longer and darker, was braided into ceremonial patterns. A beaded collar was fastened to his chest, and rings placed on each finger, each bearing the seal of some forgotten ancestor. But it was his eyes the priests focused on most. A pharaoh must not blink in uncertainty, they would say. Let the people believe you see the truth of all things. So he practiced. Gazing into polished obsidian, he would hold his stare until his vision blurred, learning to control even the smallest tremor. The rituals were exhaustive, yet they were but the prelude. What followed were hours spent in the audience hall, seated upon a throne that was colder than it appeared, listening to endless petitions. Nobles with glistening robes, farmers with sunburned cheeks, generals with scarred brows, all came before him, and all bowed. They spoke of taxes, of disputes over land, of omens read in goat entrails. Some wept, some shouted. But Nebmaat was always expected to remain calm, distant, just slightly above the reach of ordinary men. When he ruled in favour, they praised his divine wisdom. When he denied them, they murmured about balance and fate. Never was it him who decided, always the will of the gods. But even gods, it seemed, could be made to feel powerless. One afternoon, amid the clamour of a particularly heated debate over grain distribution, a messenger arrived, breathless, dust-covered, with scrolls wrapped in linen. A plague had struck in the delta. Livestock dead, children fevered, entire villages sealed in silence and salt. The priests moved quickly to contain panic. They declared it a curse sent by Seth, god of storms and chaos. Rituals were doubled, offerings increased. Nebmaat was ordered to stand before the people, radiant and untouched, to reassure them that Ma'at, order, still held. But in the dead of night he read the reports himself, unfiltered, brutal, the suffering scrawled in crude hand by scribes who no longer cared for formalities. Desperate words, starvation, burials without rites, children buried beside their mothers. He sat alone with the scrolls until the first light bled into the room, casting long, broken shadows across the floor. And for the first time he wept not in silence but aloud, the cry of a boy still trapped inside the image of a god. The following week he broke another rule. Disguised in a simple robe and veiled hood, he left the palace through a servant's gate before dawn. Only Camoiset knew, and the old man said nothing, merely pressing a small amulet into Nebmaat's palm, a charm of protection old and cracked. He rowed in a reed boat along one of the lesser canals, surrounded not by guards, but by fishermen and ferrymen who paid him no attention. They called him stranger, offered him figs and bread, and spoke of the plague with fear in their voices. He listened, not as Pharaoh, but as a traveller. What he saw in the delta stayed with him. The sick lying beneath makeshift awnings, the priests blessing them from a distance but never touching. The children, eyes glassy and limbs too thin. No gold, no rituals, just suffering, raw and unhidden. He stayed for only a day, yet it stretched within him like an echo. He returned to the palace with dirt on his hands and a changed expression the stewards could not quite name. From that moment, something inside him began to shift. He still performed the rituals, still sat upon the throne, but behind his eyes, a different vision took root. One where Pharaoh was not merely a symbol, but a servant, not of the gods, but of the people themselves. Not everyone welcomed this change. The high priest of Ammon, a man named Nebmaat, had long held sway over the spiritual and political workings of the court. He was tall, austere, and always spoke as though Ra himself had whispered truths into his ear. He had mentored Nebmaat since childhood, shaping his thoughts like a sculptor shapes stone. But now the boy was resisting the chisel. Nebmaat noticed, and he warned him. "A pharaoh is not made to walk among the sick," he said one morning, his voice smooth but tight. "The gods do not wish to see their image sullied by plague and dust. Remember, Nebmaat, you are not a man." Nebmaat looked at him, quiet and composed. "Then what am I if not a man?" The priest did not answer. He simply turned and walked away. Days passed, then weeks, and whispers began to rise like wind through the reeds. Some said the pharaoh was growing soft. Others feared he was being seduced by lower ideals, that too much empathy invited chaos, that Maat must be protected even at the cost of mercy. But still, Nebmaat continued, quietly funding healers, sending grain to villages in secret, visiting the temple schools disguised as a novice, and always returning to the palace before dawn, his secrets hidden behind the stillness of his gaze. By his 17th year, he had mastered the mask. None could tell when he lied or when he loved. But inside the unrest swelled, not rebellion, not yet, just a growing ache, like a song half forgotten, calling from deep within the stone walls. In the evenings he would sit with Camoiset beside a brazier of burning cedar. The old man's hands trembled now, but his eyes remained sharp. "You've seen what they don't want you to see," he murmured one night, "and once you've seen it, you cannot unsee." Nebmaat nodded slowly. His voice was soft but certain. "I want to be a pharaoh who remembers what it means to be human." The fire cracked, casting shadows that danced like spirits against the wall. Neither spoke again that night, but in the silence something ancient stirred. Not in the land, not in the gods, but in the heart of a boy who, against all odds, had not forgotten how to feel. The palace, ever a vessel of quiet control, had begun to shift in tone. Whispers passed more quickly through its sandstone halls. Hushed conversations now carried an edge of unease. The air was no longer simply perfumed with incense and pressed herbs. It carried the faint scent of caution, as though something invisible stirred just beneath the surface of daily ritual. Nebmaat, in his 18th year, stood taller now, his figure lean but strong, his face more angular, and his presence more commanding. When he entered a room, voices softened and heads bowed, not only from duty, but from the slow-growing sense that this pharaoh, their pharaoh, was not entirely as the others had been. He still performed the rites, still stood before the altars as the sun's rays passed through the temple's axis, bathing him in golden light, still listened to the prayers, touched the sacred relics, and offered incense to the carved gods. But there was something behind his eyes now, something older than his years, a burden quietly borne. Behind the temple walls, the high priest Nebmaat had begun to gather his influence more tightly. He met often with the inner circle of nobles and generals, cloaked in veils of tradition, feasting while speaking softly about preserving order, about maintaining the sacred balance, about whether the heart of the pharaoh still pulsed in time with Ma'at. User-Enmut, though outwardly loyal, had begun to doubt. He saw in Nebmaat a different kind of ruler, one who sought not control through fear, but closeness through compassion. And to the high priest, such things were dangerous. Compassion could blur the sharp lines of hierarchy. Empathy, left unchecked, could unravel the ancient threads that held the kingdom in place. It was during one of these sacred festivals, the day of Ra's zenith, when the sun reached its highest point and the people flooded the streets in celebration, that the first public sign of Nebmaat's divergence appeared. Traditionally, the pharaoh was carried through the city atop a gilded platform, hidden behind veils of white linen, shielded from the common eye, waved at but never truly seen. But that year, Nebmaat did not enter the palanquin. Instead, he walked, barefoot. He stepped into the dusty streets, his gold-trimmed robe trailing in the sand, his head unshielded from the blazing sun. The crowds fell silent as he passed, unsure whether to bow or run. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. Elders muttered blessings under their breath. And still he walked, smiling gently, pausing to touch the hand of an old woman, to offer a quiet word to a farmer, to receive a garland of lotus blossoms from a young girl whose fingers trembled. The priests behind him paled. The nobles whispered. But the people, oh, the people, they began to murmur something new. Not in fear nor awe, but in reverence born of recognition. He had stepped down from the pedestal. He had made himself visible. That night, the celebration burned bright. Fires lit the skies, drums echoed across the Nile, and dancers spun in rhythm with the sacred chants. But within the palace walls, the council chambers were cold and tense. User-Enmut, his robes heavy with embroidery, addressed the inner court with slow, deliberate calm. A pharaoh is not meant to be seen as a man. He is Ra's chosen, a divine vessel. If that sanctity is questioned, even gently, it opens the gate to chaos. Some nodded, others hesitated, but all felt the weight of his words. Nebmaat did not attend that meeting. He remained in the temple gardens, beneath a fig tree that had stood longer than most dynasties. With him sat Khemwaset, his presence more frail by the week. The old man coughed often now, and his bones moved with audible resistance. But his voice remained a grounding thread in the tapestry of Nebmaat's solitude. "They fear you," Khemwaset said softly. "They fear change," Nebmaat replied. "They are the same." A long silence passed between them, broken only by the chirping of frogs hidden in the papyrus thickets. Then, after a moment, Nebmaat asked, "Were they always like this? The priests, the court?" Khemwaset tilted his head, reflecting. "They were always cautious. They are not evil, Nebmaat, but they are devoted, not to the gods, not truly. They are devoted to what they understand. And you, my son, are beginning to walk a path that they do not." The young pharaoh looked down at his hands. They were no longer the soft hands of a child, nor the untouched hands of a priest. They bore the faint lines of labour, of age, of decision, and yet they trembled. "I don't wish to be a god," he said at last. "I wish to be a good king." Khemwaset reached out, laying his hand upon Nebmaat's. "Then you must prepare, for those are not always the same thing." Not long after, rumours began to surface, quiet at first but persistent, that the priests of Amun had begun holding rites without inviting the pharaoh, that User-Enmut had received omens warning of imbalance, that generals were being offered gifts in private. Nebmaat heard all of it, and yet he remained still. He did not respond with decree or punishment. Instead, he turned inward. He began meeting with scholars, healers, and farmers in secret. He asked questions about the land, about the river's shifts, about how harvests were truly managed. He read ancient scrolls by moonlight, his eyes scanning the thoughts of kings long buried, some forgotten, others disgraced. He did not sleep much, but he grew wiser. It was during one such night, candlelight flickering against the walls of the royal library, that he stumbled across a curious record, the account of a pharaoh named Nephirim, whose reign had lasted only 5 seasons. Buried without a full temple, his name scratched out on official records, he was spoken of as cursed. But the scroll, written in a shaky hand by a loyal servant, told a different story. Nephirim had tried to reshape the court, had opened granaries to the hungry, had sent priests back to the villages to tend to the sick. He had been beloved, but quietly and only by the people. The temple turned on him. His rule ended in silence. Nebmaat read the scroll 3 times. Then he folded it gently and placed it beneath his robe. The echo of Neferem's fate did not frighten him, but it lingered like a whisper at the edge of every decision. For in the corridors of power, history did not only live in stone and script, it breathed in shadows. It waited patient and watchful for those who dared walk a different road. And Nebmaat now more than ever had begun to walk it alone. The sound of the Nile lapping gently against its banks had always been a kind of lullaby for the palace, soft, rhythmic, eternal. But in Nebmaat's 19th year, even that familiar song seemed to carry a tone of warning. The waters were lower than before, the reeds sparse in places once thick with green. Fishermen spoke in uncertain voices. The sky remained cloudless for weeks, and the priests interpreted this absence not as misfortune, but as a call for greater devotion. Ceremonies multiplied, more incense, more offerings. The air in the temple became thick with burning resins, cloying to the breath. The priests knelt until their knees bled, and still they demanded more from the pharaoh. Longer rituals, heavier robes, stricter observances. Nebmaat endured it all, but his mind was elsewhere. He had begun dreaming again. Not visions sent by gods, nor nightmares, but quiet dreams. Of walking alone across the fields, barefoot and unburdened. Of laughing with faces he had never met. Of being unnamed, unseen, just a man among men. And each morning, waking to find himself still encased in the silent fortress of his station. Kamwaset's health was failing. The old man now moved with the help of a carved cane, and his voice came and went like a breeze through dry leaves. Each night he would rest in a shaded room overlooking the lotus pond, attended by only one servant, and visited by Nebmaat more often than anyone else. They spoke less now, but their silences were companionable. The pharaoh would bring him warm dates and fresh honey bread, and Kamwaset in return would press fragile scrolls into his hand, stories, records, poems nearly lost to time. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and the first stars blinked to life, Kamwaset handed Nebmaat a scroll, older than any he had yet seen. Its papyrus was brittle, its ink faded to rust, but its words still sang with quiet force. It was a poem, anonymous, unsigned and unloved by the scribes. It told of a ruler who loved his people more than his own name, who stepped down from his throne to live among the farmers, who died with no tomb, no monuments, but whose memory lingered like the scent of jasmine after rain. Read it 3 times. Then, slowly, he folded the scroll and placed it beneath his sash. That night, he stood alone on the palace balcony. The city spread below him like a silent prayer. The moon was high, casting silver light across rooftops and alleyways. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a lullaby floated through the open window of a poor home. In that moment, he felt the full breadth of his kingdom, not as land and tribute, but as breath and body, lives, each delicate as flame. And yet so much of the court saw only the throne, the rituals, the stone permanence of legacy. The next day, Nebmaat summoned the temple architects. They arrived, robes stiff with starch, eyes wary. They bowed, murmured the proper greetings, and waited for instruction. "I wish to commission a new structure," Nebmaat said, his voice calm but clear. "Not a temple, not a monument." The architects looked at one another, uncertain. "A place of healing," he continued, "not just for the rich. A house where physicians and midwives may serve any who come, free of gold, free of offerings." The oldest among them cleared his throat. Commonplace, Majesty? Open to all?" "Yes," Nebmaat replied, "built near the river, with gardens, light, water." There was a long pause, then a bow, then silence. The temple builders left without speaking further, and that night their footsteps echoed through the corridors, longer than usual. When the news reached the court, it was met with confusion. When it reached User-en-Mout, it was met with rage. The high priest arrived the next morning, draped in layers of ceremonial gold, flanked by lesser priests who moved like shadows. He did not kneel. Instead, he looked at Nebmaat with a smile that barely reached his lips. "Majesty," he began, "the gods must remain central. If healing is to be offered, it should be done through their hands." Nebmaat did not rise from his seat. "The gods do not need buildings to act." "True," User-en-Mout replied, "but the people need reminders. Without the temples, they forget who grants their breath. They do not forget breath when they are gasping for it. For a moment, Only the soft rustle of papyrus could be heard from the scribes seated along the edges of the room. User-En-Moot's expression did not change, but something in his posture did. He bowed, finally, then turned and left. The priests followed. The doors closed. In the days that followed, Nebmaat visited the edge of the city where the new healing house would rise. He stood barefoot in the soil, marked where the walls would stand, where the wells would be dug. He spoke to masons directly, to carpenters and potters and cooks. Not as Pharaoh, but as a man building something real. When the first stone was laid, he did not summon the court. No musicians, no sacred oils. Only silence. Only the sound of work beginning, honest and slow. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the palace, not in the temples, but in the people. They began to speak of him differently, no longer only as the divine one or son of the sun, but as Nebmaat the gentle, the listening pharaoh, the one who walks the earth. Not everyone approved. Some nobles kept their distance. Some generals muttered about softness, about weakened rule. But others, quiet voices at first, began to nod. He had not ruled with spectacle. He had not changed law by decree, but he had changed something harder to name, the shape of belief. One day, walking through the nearly finished gardens beside the healing house, Nebmaat saw a girl laying near the water's edge. She could not have been more than 7, with dusty feet and wild braids. She looked up at him without fear and held out a stone shaped like a heart. "For you," she said simply. He took it. No guards moved. No one spoke. And he smiled. The stone, smooth and pale, remained with him always. Not worn on a necklace, not displayed in court. Just held in the quiet moments when the burden grew too heavy. For in that heart-shaped stone was a kind of truth none of the priests could teach. And in Nebmaat it found the only pharaoh willing to carry it. The air over Thebes had begun to thicken, not only with the heat of a slow-coming summer, but with the invisible tension that crept behind closed doors and gilded screens. The scent of orange blossoms lingered sweetly in the palace courtyards, but beneath it was something sharper. The smell of anticipation, of decisions forming in silence. Nebmaat, now nearing 20, had grown into his role with a bearing that unnerved those who had once seen him as a boy. He was still quiet, still deliberate, but the softness of youth had been replaced by a deeper stillness, the kind that waits, listens, and then speaks with a weight far greater than volume. He did not need to raise his voice. The court leaned in to hear him. The house of healing neared completion. Workers moved like ants beneath linen canopies, lifting mud bricks with rhythm, singing low songs of the Nile's memory. Herbs were planted in wide troughs, mint, hibiscus, and blue lotus. Pools were shaped from stone to collect clean water, and shaded chambers built for rest and recovery. It was not large, it was not grand, but it was new. Nebmaat visited often, dressed in simple linen, face uncovered. He spoke with the herbalists, asked after the patients, and helped lift the wounded when no one watched. Rumours followed him, of course, of a pharaoh who touched the sick with his own hands, who helped grind bark into powder for pain, who gave water to the thirsty from his own cup. But not all whispers were kind. In the temple of Amun, User-En-Moot walked in circles, his steps echoing across cool stone. His face remained calm in public, but in private his thoughts stormed. The rituals continued. The sacred bark paraded through columns, chants rising like smoke. But something had shifted. The people were beginning to look elsewhere for their hope. Not to the priests, not to the towering gods behind veils, but to the living man who walked among them. This, to User-En-Moot, was heresy. Not in the sense of blasphemy, for Nebmaat still honoured the rites, but in the more dangerous sense that the structure of power was being altered not with fire or rebellion, but with humility, and that in time could be more subversive than any sword. Behind closed curtains he spoke with generals, with noble families, with those who had the most to lose if change came too swiftly. He is kind, they said, uncertain. He is naive, User-En-Moot countered, and dangerous in his naivety. Some listened, others hesitated. In response, User-En-Moot reached deeper into his own influence. He began to promote younger priests, more pliant, less questioning. He conducted ceremonies in Nebmaat's name, publicly flattering him while subtly twisting the words, casting the pharaoh as the sole bridge between the gods and men, and elevating him to the edge of divinity in a way that was meant to isolate him. He sought to trap him not with chains, but with reverence, Nebmaat noticed. One morning, he asked for the ceremonial scripts before a major feast. What he read disturbed him. Long passages extolling him as the morning sun incarnate, the breath of Ra made flesh, the one before whom all knees bend, even the winds. He sent them back with quiet instruction. Strike the phrases, shorten the chants, let the people pray to the gods, not to him. The high priest returned the scrolls with the words intact. The feast proceeded, and Nebmaat stood on the temple steps, receiving the chants like a man drowning in praise he did not request. The crowd cheered, incense burned high into the columns, and drums echoed until the stars came out. But when it ended and the lights were dimmed, Nebmaat did not return to the palace. He walked alone to the garden of the House of Healing, sat beside the half-filled lotus pond, and stared into the water. His reflection wavered with the breeze. Kaimwaset joined him there, wrapped in a wool shawl, slower now in all things. He lowered himself carefully beside his pharaoh, his breath audible. "They mean to separate you," he said quietly. Nebmaat nodded. "They hope to raise you so high," Kaimwaset continued, "that no one may ever reach you again." "I won't let them," Nebmaat said. "I was born above the people, but I refuse to die alone." The old man gave a faint smile. "Then you must walk carefully, for those who fear being left behind often become desperate." In the following weeks, Nebmaat began to change his approach, not louder, not bolder, but quieter still. He removed the golden ornaments from his audience room, held open courts under fig trees instead of stone columns, met with scribes and teachers, with midwives and tradesmen. He began asking questions of their lives, their customs, their griefs. What he heard changed him. He heard of a farmer's son who drowned because no priest would bless him without coin. Of a widow turned away from burial rites because she had no linen to offer. Of a child denied schooling because he was born to a family of sandcutters rather than grain lords. These stories did not cause rage in Nebmaat, not outwardly, but they deepened his resolve. He called for scribes and ordered that a new record be kept, a hidden ledger of all complaints, received in secret, written plainly. It was not law, not yet, but it was memory. And in a kingdom that had forgotten how to remember the lowborn, memory was the first step toward justice. Meanwhile, in the temple, Uzerenmut increased his own rituals. The statues of the gods were clothed in finer linen, offerings tripled. More priests were sent into the countryside, not to serve, but to remind the people of whom they owed their loyalty. A shadow war had begun, one of devotion, of perception. And at its heart stood a pharaoh who refused to play his part as either tyrant or deity. One night, as a sandstorm howled faintly on the horizon, Nebmaat stood on the roof of his palace, alone beneath the stars. The wind tugged at his robe, and the stone beneath his feet was warm with the memory of the day's sun. In his hand, he held the heart-shaped stone the child had once given him. He turned it over slowly, then closed his eyes. "Let me be remembered not for how I ruled," he whispered to the night, "but for how I listened." The storm passed without touching the city. But in the temples, in the barracks, in the unseen spaces of fear and power, winds had already begun to shift. And in the silence between them, Nebmaat stood, unmoving, undivided, and quietly determined. The arrival of the flood season was once a time of music, dance, and the deep sigh of the land exhaling relief. The black silt of the Nile's gift promised fertility, and the people rejoiced as the waters returned, faithful as breath. But in Nebmaat's 20th year, the waters came late. The priests declared it a test from the gods, a call to purify the temples, to double incense, to chant from dawn till dusk. Offerings piled high before altars, goats and oil, bread and barley, as though the flood might be coaxed back with smoke and blood. But Nebmaat saw the worry beneath their eyes. From the balcony overlooking the river, he watched the slow, sluggish rise of the water. In the villages, families dug deeper wells, fields dried at the edges. And yet the court spoke of nothing but omens. Not a word of grain reserves, not a plan for leaner seasons, only ritual. Nebmaat began to visit the granaries at night, unannounced, guided by trusted stewards. What he saw chilled him. Vaults less full than the records claimed, some stores corrupted by damp and rot, others quietly sold by corrupt officials to merchants seeking profit from famine. The pharaoh returned to his chambers with dust on his cloak and silence in his voice. That night he summoned no council. He wrote letters with his own hand, sealing them with wax marked by his personal ring. Not the royal seal, but the one given by Kenwaset, carved with the lotus and the eye. Messengers were sent across the kingdom, discreet, careful, quick. He called upon the trusted few who had not yet bent under temple pressure, village heads, low-born scribes, wise women, and grain keepers who remembered their oaths not to gold, but to the land. Together, they began a quiet task: to count, to weigh, to measure truth. As these secret reports returned to the palace, a map took shape, not one of rivers and borders, but of neglect, of hunger already forming like a bruise beneath the skin of prosperity. Entire districts where priests had redirected water channels to favour temple fields. Towns where scribes had inflated numbers to curry favour. And worst of all, storerooms once full, now nearly empty, though the records swore otherwise. Nebmaat did not call for punishment, not yet. Instead, he quietly restructured the grain distribution. He ordered surplus to be shifted from palace stores to rural caches. He appointed women from village councils as overseers, a move that shocked the court and gave them authority above the priests in matters of food. The high priest, hearing of this, stormed into the court one afternoon under the guise of sacred ritual. The hall was quiet as he approached the throne, his steps like falling stone. "This is a dangerous path," User-and-Moot said, not bowing. "To place power in hands untrained in the divine order is to invite collapse." Nebmaat met his gaze without flinching. "Is the divine order so fragile it fears the wisdom of women who have fed their people longer than our records can recall?" The court held its breath. User-and-Moot's voice remained calm. "Majesty, we advise caution, not to hinder, but to protect." "Then protect those who hunger," Nebmaat said, "not those who dine daily beneath gold." There was no applause, no reaction from the rows of nobles and priests, only the silent shifting of thoughts. In the days that followed, Nebmaat moved further from the rituals, not out of rebellion, but of necessity. He still made offerings, still bowed before the great statues, but he no longer allowed himself to be hidden behind veils or carried on thrones. When he spoke to the people, it was not through proclamation, but through presence. He began walking the riverbanks again quietly, with only one or two companions, often in disguise. He listened, he watched, and what he saw confirmed what the scrolls could not show. The soft desperation of a people taught to suffer in silence. A mother nursing a child with eyes too large for its face, a fisherman mending nets that had caught nothing for weeks, a girl scraping flour from the inside of a storage jar, her hands thin as reeds. And yet, in every village, in every dusty street, they still bowed when they realised who he was. Not out of fear, but because they saw in him something that most had forgotten to expect from kings: grief. He grieved with them, not aloud, not with tears, but with a quiet that mirrored their own. A sorrow born not of guilt, but of witnessing. At night, in the palace gardens, Nebmaat sat again with Kenwaset. The old man had grown so frail now that he barely moved, his voice a whisper, his bones nearly weightless beneath layers of linen. "I fear," Nebmaat said once, "that I was born to mend something already broken." Kenwaset, eyes half closed, answered slowly, "Then you are doing what the gods themselves could not." The next morning, Nebmaat stood before the priests in the inner court. "I will lead the procession this year," he said. "Not in chariots, not beneath shade. I will walk with the people." User-and-Moot narrowed his eyes. "Tradition does not permit." "I am tradition," Nebmaat interrupted, his voice even, "and I choose to walk." And so, when the Feast of the Inundation began, marking the Nile's rise and the blessing of fertility, Nebmaat walked from the palace to the river's edge on foot, robed in linen stained with use, his feet bare. The people gathered in silence, their eyes wide, their hands raised not in ritual but in awe. No gold, no fanfare, just the Pharaoh, walking like any man. He knelt and touched the water, whispered a blessing not written in any scroll, and then he rose and turned back toward the crowd. No priests spoke, no drums played. And yet, in that quiet moment, something deep and old shifted. A king had knelt not to the gods, but to the river itself, and the people watching from the banks wept not in fear or joy, but in something far rarer: recognition. The floodwaters eventually came, slow and hesitant, but enough to ease the dread that had gripped the river's edge. The silt returned, dark and rich, blanketing the fields in the promise of green. The people rejoiced cautiously, not with wild celebration, but with quiet gratitude. They had seen too closely how fragile the rhythms of life could be. In the palace, the tide of opinion also shifted, but not with the ease of water. Beneath the polished floors and woven tapestries, the undercurrent of politics grew heavier. For while the people praised Nebmaat for his walk through the city, for the food arriving in barren towns, for the healing house now open and filled with life, others grew restless. The temple's hold had not vanished. It had simply gone deeper. In hidden chambers beneath the sanctuary of Amun, Nebmaat began gathering his most loyal acolytes. He spoke not in rage, but in careful tones, precise and deliberate, each word placed like a stone in a wall yet to be built. "We are not enemies of the Pharaoh," he told them, hands folded, eyes closed. "We are guardians, we are watchers. If the divine vessel cracks, the gods do not bleed, the people do." He never called it a conspiracy, never uttered the word rebellion, only concern, only care. But outside those stone walls, Nebmaat felt the weight of it. The dreams had returned, not the peaceful ones, but the ones filled with strange symbols. Water that ran backward, temples crumbling into ash, voices chanting in languages he did not know. He awoke each time with the taste of copper in his mouth, the memory of smoke lingering in his lungs. Camwaset saw the change. The old man had become little more than a shadow wrapped in linen, but his mind remained sharp. When Nebmaat visited, they no longer spoke of politics or grain. They spoke instead of memory. "There is a difference," Camwaset said once, "between remembering history and carrying it." Nebmaat nodded slowly. "I fear I carry too much." Camwaset smiled faintly. "That is why you must learn when to lay it down." It was not long after that the first incident occurred. In a temple outside the capital, small, provincial, barely known to the court, a statue of the pharaoh was found broken. Not by accident. Its head had been removed, its name chiselled from the base. The priests there claimed ignorance, said it was thieves, said it was chaos. Nebmaat received the news with silence. He did not demand punishment. He did not call for public outrage. Instead, he had the broken statue brought to the palace. He placed it in the garden of the healing house, its missing head turned gently toward the lotus pond. And when asked why, he simply said, "Let it remain as proof that no man is beyond error." But the message was clear. Even symbols could be dismantled. Even pharaohs could be challenged. Still, Nebmaat did not retreat. If anything, he stepped further into the world he was reshaping. He began commissioning new scribes, not from the temples, but from village schools. Young, clever, skeptical of ceremony, he had them write scrolls not of conquest but of daily life, how bread was baked, how wells were cleaned, how mothers soothed fevers in the dark. These scrolls were copied, distributed, taught. He wanted the kingdom to remember itself, not in monuments but in the breath of its people. Meanwhile, the nobles found themselves caught in uncertainty. Many still relied on the temple, its blessings and its protection. But more and more, their tenants whispered the name Nebmaat with affection. What ruler had ever walked barefoot into a grain field? What king had shared food from his own plate with a stonemason's child? Affection in time becomes pressure, and pressure in time becomes danger. One evening, after a day spent visiting irrigation workers along the river, Nebmaat returned to find a scroll waiting in his chamber. No seal, no name, just words, written in careful, thin script. "The jackal walks where the falcon sleeps. Be mindful of your priests." He showed it to no one, burned it over a quiet flame. But the warning settled into his ribs like sand. That same night, a servant found a jar of wine in his chamber, unmarked, unopened. It had not been placed there by any known steward. Nebmaat had it poured into the palace garden's soil, watched as the ants avoided it. Poison, perhaps, or only fear. But the message was clear. He was no longer only watched. He was being weighed. He tightened his circle further. Only 3 were allowed into his private chambers now. An old steward who had once been his wet nurse's son, a physician from the healing house, and a scribe named Emily, a quiet woman with ink-stained hands and a sharp mind. Together they began preparing something that no pharaoh had done in centuries. A declaration of governance separate from divine instruction. Not a rejection of the gods, but a recognition that the gods might not always speak through stone and incense. A scroll was drafted, plain, firm, without ornament. It spoke of balance not as a heavenly gift but as a responsibility. It outlined laws of fairness, access to food, education for children of all castes, and the limiting of priestly control over land and labour. Nebmaat planned to read it aloud himself, but as the day of declaration neared, Cainwaset's breath grew shallow. The old man had lived longer than most scribes, served more kings than anyone remembered, and now as his spirit readied itself to leave, he asked for one thing: to see Nebmaat one last time beneath the fig tree. They met there, at dusk, the palace silent around them. Cainwaset's voice was nearly gone, but his eyes, still dark, still sharp, held the pharaoh's gaze. "You carry the future like a jug of oil," he whispered. "Step carefully, my son. Not every path can be walked without spilling." Nebmaat knelt beside him. "I won't let it break." The old man smiled, closed his eyes, and as night fell, so too did one of the last voices of wisdom in Nebmaat's life, quiet as a leaf falling into still water. And in the silence that followed, the weight on the pharaoh's shoulders grew heavier than ever before. The floodwaters eventually came, slow and hesitant, but enough to ease the dread that had gripped the river's edge. The silt returned, dark and rich, blanketing the fields in the promise of green. The people rejoiced cautiously, not with wild celebration, but with quiet gratitude. They had seen too closely how fragile the rhythms of life could be. In the palace, the tide of opinion also shifted, but not the ease of water. Beneath the polished floors and woven tapestries, the undercurrent of politics grew heavier. For while the people praised Nebmaat for his walk through the city, for the food arriving in barren towns, for the healing house now open and filled with life, others grew restless. The temple's hold had not vanished. It had simply gone deeper. In hidden chambers beneath the sanctuary of Amun, Useremmut began gathering his most loyal acolytes. He spoke not in rage but in careful tones, precise and deliberate, each word placed like a stone in a wall yet to be built. "We are not enemies of the pharaoh," he told them, hands folded, eyes closed. "We are guardians, we are watchers. If the divine vessel cracks, the gods do not bleed, the people do." He never called it a conspiracy, never uttered the word rebellion, only concern, only care. But outside those stone walls, Nebmaat felt the weight of it. The dreams had returned, not the peaceful ones, but the ones filled with strange symbols. Water that ran backward, temples crumbling into ash, voices chanting in languages he did not know. He awoke each time with the taste of copper in his mouth, the memory of smoke lingering in his lungs. Cainwaset saw the change. The old man had become little more than a shadow wrapped in linen, but his mind remained sharp. When Nebmaat visited, they no longer spoke of politics or grain. They spoke instead of memory. "There is a difference," Cainwaset said once, "between remembering history and carrying it." Nebmaat nodded slowly. "I fear I carry too much." Cainwaset smiled faintly. "That is why you must learn when to lay it down." It was not long after that the first incident occurred. In a temple outside the capital, small, provincial, barely known to the court, a statue of the pharaoh was found broken. Not by accident, its head had been removed, its name chiselled from the base. The priests there claimed ignorance, said it was thieves, said it was chaos. Nebmaat received the news with silence. He did not demand punishment. He did not call for public outrage. Instead, he had the broken statue brought to the palace. He placed it in the garden of the healing house, its missing head turned gently toward the lotus pond. And when asked why, he simply said, "Let it remain as proof that no man is beyond error." But the message was clear. Even symbols could be dismantled. Even pharaohs could be challenged. Still, Nebmaat did not retreat. If anything, he stepped further into the world he was reshaping. He began commissioning new scribes, not from the temples, but from village schools. Young, clever, sceptical of ceremony, he had them write scrolls not of conquest, but of daily life. How bread was baked, how wells were cleaned, how mothers soothed fevers in the dark. These scrolls were copied, distributed, taught. He wanted the kingdom to remember itself, not in monuments, but in the breath of its people. Meanwhile, the nobles found themselves caught in uncertainty. Many still relied on the temple, its blessings and its protection. But more and more, their tenants whispered the name Nebmaat with affection. What ruler had ever walked barefoot into a grain field? What king had shared food from his own plate with a stonemason's child? Affection, in time, becomes pressure, and pressure in time becomes danger. One evening, after a day spent visiting irrigation workers along the river, Nebmaat returned to find a scroll waiting in his chamber. No seal, no name, just words written in careful thin script. The jackal walks where the falcon sleeps. Be mindful of your priests. He showed it to no one, burned it over a quiet flame, but the warning settled into his ribs like sand. That same night, a servant found a jar of wine in his chamber, unmarked, unopened. It had not been placed there by any known steward. Nebmaat had it poured into the palace garden soil, watched as the ants avoided it. Poison, perhaps, or only fear. But the message was clear. He was no longer only watched. He was being weighed. He tightened his circle further. Only 3 were allowed into his private chambers now. An old steward who had once been his wet nurse's son, a physician from the healing house, and a scribe named Emeni, a quiet woman with ink-stained hands and a sharp mind. Together they began preparing something that no pharaoh had done in centuries, a declaration of governance, separate from divine instruction. Not a rejection of the gods, but a recognition that the gods might not always speak through stone and incense. A scroll was drafted, plain, firm, without ornament. It spoke of balance not as a heavenly gift, but as a responsibility. It outlined laws of fairness, access to food, education for children of all castes, and the limiting of priestly control over land and labour. Nebmaat planned to read it aloud himself, but as the day of declaration neared, Kamwaset's breath grew shallow. The old man had lived longer than most scribes, served more kings than anyone remembered. And now, as his spirit readied itself to leave, he asked for one thing, to see Nebmaat one last time beneath the fig tree. They met there at dusk, the palace silent around them. Kamwaset's voice was nearly gone, but his eyes, still dark, still sharp, held the pharaoh's gaze. "You carry the future like a jug of oil," he whispered. "Step carefully, my son. Not every path can be walked without spilling." Nebmaat knelt beside him. "I won't let it break." The old man smiled, closed his eyes, and as night fell, so too did one of the last voices of wisdom in Nebmaat's life, quiet as a leaf falling into still water. And in the silence that followed, the weight on the pharaoh's shoulders grew heavier than ever before. The palace wore mourning like a second skin. No great wails echoed through its halls. No dramatics of grief, no tearing of robes. Just silence, the kind that settles in corners and lingers long after the last visitor leaves. The fig tree under which Kamwaset had passed was left untouched. No servant dared sweep its fallen leaves. Nebmaat did not appear at the court the next morning, nor the day after. The ministers whispered, unsure if the young pharaoh had retreated or merely waited. In truth, he had gone to the archives. Deep beneath the palace, where the air smelled of dust and old wax, lay the sealed vaults. Scrolls not read in generations, laws etched on clay papyri stiffened by time. By torchlight, Nebmaat read. He was seeking not inspiration, but precedent. If he was to speak the declaration, the great scroll of balance, then he must do so with the weight of history behind him, not only his own courage. And in the brittle records of long-buried kings, he found pieces of what he needed, moments of dissent, of reform, of forgotten pharaohs who had tried and failed to pull power from the sacred and return it to the people. He read of King Seneca, who had abolished a tax on widows, of Queen Tahure, who had opened temple schools to children of artisans, of Nepharem again, the silenced pharaoh whose memory had been smeared, but whose voice still lingered in ink. He gathered these fragments and wove them into a silent promise. When he emerged at last, days later, he summoned Emeni, the scribe, to his private chamber. Together they unfurled the declaration once more. She dipped her reed pen in fresh ink, ready to record his final revisions. Nebmaat spoke slowly, pausing often, his eyes scanning the words like a man choosing stones to cross a deep river. "We must make it clear," he said, "that this is not blasphemy. The gods remain, but their truth must not be sold." He adjusted the phrasing of land use, ensuring that no child of the Nile would be denied grain or water due to caste. He added lines mandating the training of physicians outside temple rites. He reduced the tribute owed by villages stricken by drought or disease. And he clarified, with bold strokes, that no law should exist without the pharaoh's signature, not the priesthood's blessing. By the time the scroll was finished, the oil lamps had burned low and Emeni's fingers were blackened to the knuckles. She looked up at him once it was done. "Do you know what this will bring?" Nebmaat looked past her toward the window where dawn had just begun to bloom. "Yes," he said softly, "but I will not leave the people asleep in the old darkness." Word spread that the Pharaoh would speak to the people, not through a proclamation read by heralds, but with his own voice in the open air. The temple tried to intervene. User-Enmut sent 3 messengers, each more cautious than the last. The third arrived with a veiled warning. "Majesty," the young priest said, eyes lowered, "the gods have not approved this address." Nebmaat dismissed him without anger. On the morning of the declaration, the palace gates opened, not with ceremony, but with stillness. Nebmaat wore plain linen robes, a sash the colour of river clay, and no crown. His only adornment was a small amulet around his neck, the one Camoset had once given him in his boyhood. He walked to the great platform outside the palace, where the crowds had already gathered. Thousands stood in the sun, quiet, expectant. They had heard whispers that the Pharaoh had written a new law, that he would change the way power moved, that he would not speak in riddles or divine commands, but in words meant for human ears. Nebmaat stepped to the edge of the dais and unrolled the scroll himself. The parchment fluttered slightly in the wind, and then he began to read. His voice was low, steady, without force. He did not shout, he did not preach, he simply spoke. He spoke of balance, of grain owed to the hungry, of land meant to feed, not to dominate, of temples that must heal, not hoard, of schools that must serve not only the children of scribes, but also those born in briffles and reed boats. He spoke of remembrance, of how kingdoms die not from invasion, but from forgetting the smallest among them. And finally, he spoke of his own role. "I am Pharaoh," he said, "but I am also your servant. I do not bring rain. I do not summon the sun. I walk where you walk. And I will not rule from a seat too high to see the dust upon your feet." When he finished, he did not bow. He simply stood there, scroll in hand, waiting. There was no eruption of cheers, no wild celebration, only silence. But it was a full silence, the kind that sinks into bones, that lingers long after words have faded. Then, slowly, someone in the crowd lowered to one knee, then another and another, not out of fear or tradition or command, but in shared acknowledgement of courage, of truth. Back in the temple, User-Enmut received the news with no expression. He dismissed his attendants and sat alone before the great statue of Amun, its eyes forever unblinking, its mouth closed in eternal judgment. He lit no incense, said no prayer. He simply sat in the presence of a god who had not stopped the wind from changing. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with quiet change. Scribes copied the declaration by hand and passed it through markets and docks. Midwives gathered beneath the healing house to speak of new rites. Village elders sent offerings not to the temples, but directly to the palace. Jars of honey, bundles of herbs, folded scraps of linen embroidered with thanks. And in the court, the high priest's circle grew tighter, more secretive. For while the people had begun to hope, others had begun to plan. The palace that had once hummed with ceremonial order now moved with a slower, more uncertain rhythm. It was as though the very stones paused to listen before echoing footsteps. The declaration of balance, as it came to be known, rippled across the land in ways even Nebmaat had not fully foreseen. Villagers that once sent tribute with bowed heads began sending letters instead. Not of disobedience, but of suggestions, requests, questions. Children whose names had never been inked into temple scrolls were now being taught by scribes seated on mats, their voices echoing with wonder as they recited the words of the Pharaoh aloud. In the healing house, patient lines grew longer. Some came for medicine. Others came simply to look upon the carved words above the entrance, for all who breathe. And yet, within the golden walls of the high temples, the drums of silence grew louder. User-Enmut moved with greater care now. His steps, once measured and calm, had grown more deliberate. He spoke less in public, but more in private. He no longer challenged Nebmaat in open court. Instead, he watched, listened, waited. The priests around him had become restless. Some feared what they saw, shrines neglected, offerings fewer, the people bowing first to the Pharaoh, then to the gods. Others were emboldened, seeing in Nebmaat's reforms a weakness, a tear in the fabric of tradition, a chance to pull the threads loose. User-Enmut knew better. He understood that Nebmaat was not weak. He was, in fact, far too strong, not in body or army, but in presence. in clarity. He was winning the hearts of the people, not with conquest, but with compassion. And that to the old priest was the most dangerous kind of rule. So he began to turn his gaze inward to the temple's own guardians, the elite within the priesthood who did not kneel even before pharaohs. Men and women born into sacred duty, taught to hold Ma'at in place by any means. These were not easily swayed by kindness. A secret council was formed. They met at night within the innermost chamber of the temple, where the walls were inscribed with curses too old to be spoken aloud. They did not call their gathering rebellion. They called it preservation. "Let us not curse the pharaoh," one whispered, "but remind him that he walks only because the gods allow it." Another replied, "He has begun to forget that power must be balanced not only by mercy, but by fear." Plans were made, quiet, precise, careful as sand through a sieve. Meanwhile, in the palace, Nebmaat moved forward. He began work on a new registry, one that would catalogue not taxes or titles, but labour. Who worked the fields, who dug the wells, who mended the nets. A record not of ownership, but of contribution. "I want every life to be seen," he told Imani, as she etched names into a growing scroll, even those no one has ever asked about. The scribe nodded, though her brow tightened. That same week, a gift arrived at the palace gates. A stone basin, wide and deep, carved with the symbols of healing. No name was attached. The guards brought it into the garden of the healing house. It was admired, placed beneath a fig tree, and filled with water from the Nile. The next morning, 2 healers fell ill. Then a third. Within days, 9 were dead. The water had been poisoned. The news reached Nebmaat as he walked through the lower halls. He stopped only once, his fingers tightening briefly on the carved rail beside him. Then he asked, softly, for the basin to be shattered and buried. He did not cry. He summoned the families of the fallen, sat with them, ate their food, listened to their memories. He promised that their loved ones would be honoured not as martyrs, but as those who had served quietly and with love. The priesthood said nothing. Nebmaat's inner circle now met in tighter rooms away from windows. Imani, who once filled scrolls with ideas and visions, now also kept records of rumours, threats, missing names. The steward who had served Nebmaat since his boyhood was found dead in the herb garden one night, a thin line of blood beneath his ear. No sign of struggle, no sign of a thief. The pharaoh's chambers were inspected daily, food tasted, lamps checked for tampering. Still, Nebmaat refused to leave the palace. He would not hide. Not now. But he did change one thing. He began to write letters in his own hand, sealed, not with a raw ring, but with the carved lotus. These were sent to distant allies, to villages whose leaders had shown wisdom, to scribes in desert towns and midwives in flood-prone deltas. In each, a quiet request. Remember the law. Remember the people. If I should vanish, carry the words forward. He spoke more cautiously now in council, but more plainly in public. When he visited schools, he read stories. When he passed through markets, he offered coin not from treasury, but from his personal satchel. He laughed on occasion, smiled at children, but those closest to him saw the lines deepening beside his eyes. One evening, as the sun fell like an ember behind the city walls, Imani approached him in the garden. She carried a scroll, but did not open it. "Majesty," she said, "we have found the source of the poison." Nebmaat turned to her slowly. His face gave away nothing. A temple courier, young, likely did not know the true contents. He was paid in gold and grain. "We found his body in the river." Silence passed between them. Nebmaat finally said, "And the hand that sent him? We cannot trace it without open conflict." He nodded once. "Then we do not trace, we remember." That night he returned to the healing house. It was quieter now, the air heavy with grief. He walked among the sick, offering balm and blessings, his own hands bearing scars from weeks of quiet service. He did not speak of poison, did not speak of loss. He simply remained. Outside, in the deeper night, shadows moved through the temple like whispered prayers. But within the walls of the healing house, the candles burned low and steady. And Nebmaat, still pharaoh, still servant, knelt beside a sleeping child, dipped a cloth in water and began to soothe a fever not even his enemies could see. The sun rose pale and sluggish over Thebes, as though reluctant to cast light upon a kingdom caught in quiet fracture. Its rays spread across the rooftops, gilding temples and hovels alike. But within the palace, it was the flickering glow of oil lamps that guided most footsteps now. Nebmaat's court had grown still, not in idleness but in caution. Even the birds seemed to sing more softly among the gardens. The healing house had reopened, though its halls were quieter than before. The poisoned basin, now buried in the soil near the edge of the lotus pond, was marked only by a simple stone. Nebmaat had ordered it placed there himself. It bore no inscription, just a single carved circle, the symbol of the sun in balance. Amani had grown thinner, her eyes ever watchful. She kept a hidden ledger now, its pages filled not only with names and laws, but with observations, temple movements, changed rituals, disappearances. It was not paranoia, it was preparation. Nebmaat read from it nightly. Despite the undercurrent of danger, the pharaoh pressed on. Plans for a new hall of learning were laid, a place where scribes, healers, and even labourers' children could be taught side by side. The idea was whispered through the markets like a gentle breeze, a school for all, not just the priesthood. But within the sanctuaries of Amun, preparations of a different kind unfolded. User-and-Mute sat in council beneath a high ceiling painted with stars. Around him, his inner circle had grown bolder. No longer content with veiled resistance, they now spoke openly of divine correction. They used terms older than kingdoms, words that once meant restoration, now twisted into control. The high priest, in his usual stillness, gave them only his silence. But then, at last, he rose. There will be no call to arms, he said, his voice calm as dusk. No uprising. We do not challenge him with swords. A younger priest asked cautiously, then how? User-en-Mut turned his gaze to the flickering flame before the altar. We take away what makes him Pharaoh. The plan began with the festivals. The coming month marked the Festival of Renewal, an ancient rite meant to cleanse the spirit of the kingdom, to reaffirm the pharaoh's bond with the gods. It was usually a time of shared celebration, but now, in secret, User-en-Mut altered the scripts. He shortened the blessings, reworded the prayers, reassigned the chants to exclude Nebmaat's name. When the day came and Nebmaat arrived in the temple of Amun, he found the chamber dimly lit, the priests already in formation. There were no drums, no horns. The air was hushed, not with reverence, but with distance. He took his place before the altar, waited, but his name was never spoken. The chants began, beautiful and ancient, but carefully crafted to lift the gods above all else, and to render the pharaoh a mere witness. When the sacred libations were poured, the cup bypassed his hand. When the incense was lit, the flame was kindled not by him but by User-en-Mut himself. The gesture was clear. Nebmaat did not interrupt, did not protest. He stood quietly through the entire rite, his face unreadable. When it ended, he turned and left without a word. Later that evening, Amani approached him in the palace garden. They seek to erase your divinity, she said plainly. Nebmaat, seated beneath the fig tree, nodded. Then let them. She blinked, startled. Majesty? I was never a god, he replied. Let them take what was never truly mine. It will reveal who they are. But Amani did not look reassured. They will not stop at ritual. He looked at her then, not with defiance, but with a kind of weary clarity. I know. In the weeks that followed, Nebmaat doubled his visits to the people. He walked the length of the city's lower banks, shared meals with fishermen, sat in the shade with old men who could barely rise from their mats. He visited the granaries by night and ordered emergency stores moved to distant towns quietly facing famine. His hands grew calloused, his robes faded from sun and wear, and with each step, each gesture, the people's love deepened. Not for a god, but for a man who remained with them when others turned away. At the same time, the temple's power became more rigid. Statues of Amun were placed on higher pedestals. Access to inner sanctuaries was restricted. The temple guards, once purely ceremonial, now trained more frequently. They were seen more often outside the palace, watching, not protecting. Rumours crept through the city like ivy that the pharaoh's mind was clouded, that the gods had grown silent toward him, that a new divine vision would be revealed in time. And then, one night, a scroll was found nailed to the door of the healing house. It bore no signature, only a stamped symbol, a jackal's head inked in black. The words were sharp, written with precision. When the shepherd forgets the gods, the flock must choose anew. Let the old ways return. Let the falcon fly no more. The guards removed it quietly, but the meaning struck like thunder. Nebmaat read the scroll in private. He did not speak of it to the court. Instead, he returned to the fig tree and sat in silence until the moon rose high above the palm-lined horizon. It was not fear he felt, not even sorrow. It was a strange kind of peace, the kind that comes when one realizes the road ahead has narrowed to a single, undeniable path. The path forward was no longer about ideas. It was about endurance. He would not fight them with weapons. He would outlast them with truth. The nights grew longer, not in hours, but in feeling. A hush lingered in the air that neither breeze nor bird dared disturb. The palace remained a place of routine, but no longer of comfort. The servants walked softly. Lamps were trimmed with more care than usual, and the fig tree, once the place of stories and shared bread, now stood alone, its branches heavy with unspoken memory. Nebmaat, now 21, kept to himself more often, not out of fear, but preservation. He knew he was being watched. Every step through the halls, every scroll passed through his hands, every visitor admitted into his presence, all were noted somewhere. Perhaps by the temple, perhaps by those within his own walls. It no longer mattered. His life was no longer a private flame, but a torch caught between winds, and yet he did not extinguish it. He continued his work quietly. The school was completed, not a palace of marble, but a series of sun-baked rooms built from clay and patience. Its doors were unadorned, open to all who wished to learn. Lessons in language, in healing, in numbers and laws, taught not by priests but by those who had lived these truths. Mothers, midwives, retired scribes. Each day children gathered under its awnings, their voices rising with hope. And each evening Nebmaat would walk its corridors, brushing the walls with his fingertips as though to remind himself that something here, at least, was real. He no longer visited the great temples. His absence, of course, did not go unnoticed. Within the high sanctum of Amun, the daily rites continued, louder now, more elaborate. Pharaoh had taken to invoking the gods with new titles older than the ones even Nebmaat had learned as a child. He spoke of cosmic order, of divine hierarchy, of the falcon's shadow fading from the heavens. Always in metaphor, always just enough to avoid treason. But the message echoed clearly through the marble halls. A pharaoh who forgets his gods is no pharaoh at all. Some in the court began to shift their posture, a few turned cool, others left small offerings at the temple again, out of caution rather than belief. A nobleman from the eastern province withdrew his support from the healing house, citing religious dissonance. A general, once loyal, requested reassignment to the northern border. Nebmaat did not rebuke them. He knew the tides. Even the strongest swimmers, he had once said, may tire beneath a rising current. Yet he did not yield. He began a new tradition, unannounced, unrecorded, of walking the city alone at dawn. Dressed simply, hood drawn, he moved through the lower quarters. Past bakeries where dough was still rising, past stables where animals stretched against their ropes, past homes where mothers whispered lullabies to wake the youngest before labour called. He did not speak unless spoken to. Often he bought nothing, asked nothing, left no name, but word spread quietly. The Pharaoh walks among us, and with that whisper came something more enduring than worship, trust. But trust is a delicate vine, and vines are easily trampled. One morning, a fire broke out in the school. It began in the storage chamber where the scrolls were kept. The flames leapt quickly, licking up the reeds and clay, blackening the walls. Children and teachers were evacuated and no lives were lost, but half the records, half the written laws of balance were turned to smoke. There was no sign of arson, no proof, only a charred oil lamp overturned in the corner and a trail of ash that led nowhere. When the fire was reported to the court, Nebmaat stood still for a long time. Then he asked for a single name. Who gave us the lamp? It was traced back to a supplier near the temple quarter, a merchant long favoured by the priesthood. Nebmaat asked no more questions. That night he sat beneath the fig tree once more, joined only by Emeni, who brought him a new scroll, fresh papyrus, ink unspoiled. We can write it again, she said gently. He took the reed pen in silence, began. They worked through the night, rewriting from memory, the laws, the rights, the hopes. Not every word was the same. Some were clearer, some sharper. The fire, it seemed, had burned away only the surface. The truth remained. Still, Nebmaat knew the time had shortened. The veils between patience and action were thinning. A week later, a proclamation was posted on the temple gates, not from the pharaoh, but from the high priesthood. The gods call for renewal. A rite of alignment must be performed. The throne must be blessed anew. The pharaoh must stand before the council of sanctity. It was written in ceremonial language, draped in the appearance of tradition, but its meaning was clear to anyone who had lived long enough under royal shadow. This was not a request, it was a summons. Nebmaat read the proclamation in silence, then handed it back to his steward. "I will go," he said. "Alone?" He nodded. "Yes, if this is to be their reckoning, let them see my face without guards." Word spread fast. The people watched closely. Some feared he would vanish into the temple and never return. Others believed the gods would strike him down for defying their order. A few prepared to fast and pray. But when the day came, Nebmaat walked into the temple at noon, the sun high and merciless. No escort, no fanfare, just the sound of his sandals against ancient stone. The gates closed behind him with a deep, echoing finality. Inside, the Council of Sanctity waited, 12 high priests robed in white and gold, seated beneath the towering image of Amun carved into the wall. Incense smoked in thick coils. The air was heavy with ritual and intent. User-En-Mut stood at their centre. "Pharaoh Nebmaat," he intoned, voice cold and formal, "you are summoned to affirm your place, to answer the gods." Nebmaat stepped forward, head unbowed. "I am ready!" The great hall of Amun was colder than it should have been, its vast stone pillars casting long, dark shadows across the floor. No torches were lit, save for the ceremonial flame flickering near the altar. A single light, its glow dwarfed by the immensity of the chamber. The scent of frankincense and myrrh hung heavy, clinging to the skin, saturating breath. Everything was silence, controlled and sacred. Nebmaat stood alone at the centre of it all, his bare feet upon the carved ankh in the floor, his face calm, unreadable. His simple linen robe stirred slightly with the breeze seeping through the temple slits. Behind him, the great doors had shut with a sound that had echoed across the courtyard, signalling not just entry, but a test, and perhaps a verdict. User-En-Mut faced him, flanked by the 12. The Council of Sanctity, each one a guardian of the old order, of the rites that dated back to kings whose names were now dust. Their faces were unreadable beneath their tall headdresses, but their posture spoke clearly. They were not gathered to listen, they were gathered to decide. The high priest stepped forward, his voice echoing with practiced reverence. "We gather in this chamber to confirm what is holy, for when a pharaoh departs from the will of the gods, it is not the kingdom that is shaken, it is the world itself." Nebmaat did not speak. User-En-Mut continued, "You have altered rites. You have moved law beyond the temple. You have placed the care of bodies above the care of souls. These things you have done in the name of mercy. But mercy alone is not ma'at. Order is not compassion, it is balance." Still, Nebmaat did not speak. A second priest seated on the council's left raised a scroll. "We have compiled 42 deviations from the divine order, 42 marks upon the scale of truth. The number is not insignificant. It is the count of sins weighed by Osiris himself." Nebmaat raised his eyes then, not to the priest, but to the statue of Amun that loomed above them all, unmoving, eternal. Its hands outstretched, its face placid and unknowable. He spoke for the first time. "And what of the sins uncounted?" The chamber seemed to tighten. The priests shifted, but said nothing. "The child turned away from healing because her father had no coin," Nebmaat continued, voice low but unyielding. "The mother who died giving birth because her caste did not permit temple intervention. The elder buried in silence because no priest would cross the river to speak a name." He turned now to face them all. "Shall we count those as well?" User-En-Mut narrowed his eyes. "You presume to question the will of the gods. I question only those who speak it in whispers meant to serve themselves." The silence deepened. It was not rage that filled the room, but something more dangerous, fear wrapped in tradition. Nebmaat had pierced the veil, and the council now stood exposed. Another priest, older than the rest, spoke from the shadows. His voice was brittle as dry reeds. "You dishonour your crown." Nebmaat stepped forward onto the second ring of the ceremonial dais. "I do not wear the crown today. I left it on the altar of my ancestors." He reached into his robe and withdrew a strip of white cloth stained with soot. It had once wrapped the hands of a child who died in the fire at the school. He had kept it all this time. "This is the only crown I have claimed." The 12 priests looked on, their hands clasped in still prayer. But User-and-Mut's fingers twitched. "The gods do not recognize such symbols," the high priest said. "Then the gods have forgotten what suffering looks like." With that, Nebmaat stepped to the final ring, the place reserved for offerings, for the anointed to kneel and receive judgment. But he did not kneel. Instead, he sat, cross-legged, calm, human. "I will not fight you. I will not unseat you. But neither will I yield what the people have reclaimed. If the gods wish to strike me, let them. If the old order must cast me out, do so here in the light. Not with poison, not with whispers, but with truth." For a long time, no one moved. Even the incense smoke seemed to pause in midair. Then, slowly, User-and-Mut turned, walked back toward the altar. The high priest raised his arms, invoking the presence of Amun. "Let the judgment of the gods be made known," he said. The chamber darkened. A chant began. Deep, rhythmic, ancient. The 12 swayed, voices low, calling upon names older than language. Nebmaat remained still, the cloth resting in his lap. Suddenly, the flames upon the altar wavered. The ceremonial fire bent sharply, then split into two. A gust of wind tore through the chamber, despite the sealed walls, extinguishing the outer torches in a sudden breath. The priests froze. Only the central flame remained, flickering, unsteady, but burning still. User-and-Mut stepped back, eyes narrowed. One of the council whispered, "Is it a sign?" Another murmured, "The gods hesitate." Nebmaat stood slowly, his silhouette framed by the single flame. "The gods do not hesitate," he said. "Only men do." He turned and walked from the circle, past the priests, past the altar. No one reached for him. No one stopped him. When he reached the great doors, they opened of their own accord, a servant pulling them from outside, unaware of what had passed within. Nebmaat stepped into the noon light. The people were gathered beyond the courtyard walls, waiting, watching. When they saw him return, unharmed, walking upright, their silence broke, not into cheers but into breath, as though a held air had finally been released. He raised no hand. He spoke no word. But in that quiet, something settled over the city, not dominance, not divine favour, but certainty. The gods had not struck him down, and so the people would rise. The days that followed were unlike any the kingdom had known. It began with the lamps. In homes across Thebes, from the grand villas of scribes to the modest rooms of fishermen and weavers, small clay oil lamps were placed in windowsills each evening facing outward. They were unremarkable, plain, some cracked, some still bearing the soot of older nights, but they all burned, not with fire from the temple hearths, not with oils blessed by the priests, just light, humble, human, enduring. The people called them flames of witness, not in defiance, but in quiet affirmation that they had seen what transpired. The pharaoh had walked into the lion's den of gods and emerged, not as a god, but as a man unbroken. They lit lamps not to mock tradition, but to say, "We are here and we remember." Nebmaat, still adorned in his plain linen, walked the streets that week in silence. Children waved, women offered bowls of dates or figs. Men touched their foreheads and nodded low. He said little, only smiled and accepted each gesture with eyes that no longer needed words to speak reverence. At the healing house, patients now came not only for herbs and salves, but for counsel. Teachers from the school visited to sit with the sick, reading stories aloud beside their mats. The line between scholar and servant blurred further, and no one seemed to mind. The walls of station were softening, but within the temple walls, silence thickened. The priests did not speak of the judgment. They neither condemned nor acknowledged it. Instead, they continued their rites with a studied precision that only made the omission more glaring. User-and-Mut withdrew from public view. Some whispered that he was ill. Others said he fasted to atone for divine indecision. But those closest to the sanctum knew better. The high priest was not praying, he was planning. Behind locked doors, he pored over scrolls of law, old edicts, genealogies of noble houses. He sought not the gods now, but the bloodlines of loyalty, those whose ties to the temple predated even Nebmaat's line. If he could not unmake the pharaoh through ritual, he would do it through legacy. One evening, a courier arrived at the palace bearing a scroll wrapped in silken red, the colour of formal dispute. Ameni read it aloud to Nebmaat under the fig tree. It was a summons from a coalition of temple-aligned nobles and priests, requesting a formal inquiry into the pharaoh's legitimacy, not as ruler but as descendant. They questioned the purity of his mother's lineage, Claimed ancient records had surfaced showing a fracture in the royal blood. Nebmaat did not flinch. He looked up at the stars instead, already piercing the indigo sky. "I am not the Nile," he said softly, "but I am its current." Amani lowered the scroll. "They wish to drag you into the past, into dust and names." "They do," he replied, "because they cannot control the present." The next morning he held an open gathering in the courtyard of the palace. No throne was present, no banners, no guards, just a circle of stone benches shaded by hanging palm fronds. He sat among the people, not before them. A scribe's child recited a poem she had written about a lotus blooming in a cracked pot. A woman told of how the grain reforms had saved her family's farm. A blind man sang of the old gods, but in his song, Nebmaat was not their servant, nor their rival. He was their brother. In the crowd stood soldiers, merchants, labourers. Some wore clean linen, others wore dust. All listened. Nebmaat spoke last. "I was born with a crown," he said, "but I have learned that crowns are heavy with silence. I do not wish to rule in silence anymore. I ask not for your worship, only your memory. Remember what we've built. Remember why it matters." That night the lamps burned brighter. In response the temple struck, not with blades, but with law. Scrolls were dispatched to outer provinces, reasserting the temple's authority over land and water rights. Priests were sent into villages to question school leaders, to demand proof of ritual compliance, to remove scrolls bearing the declaration of balance. Some frightened, yielded. In one town, a healer was taken by temple guards for administering aid without sacred approval. In another, a teacher was dragged from her home and forced to renounce the pharaoh's laws before a stone idol. Nebmaat received the news with a clenched jaw, but he did not send soldiers. Instead, he wrote letters, long ones, to every affected village, reminding them that their pain had not gone noticed. And he dispatched emissaries not with weapons, but with builders and food. He rebuilt even as they tried to dismantle, and so the battle wore on, not with flames and arrows, but with the push and pull of presence and erasure. In a hidden chamber deep within the temple, User-en-Mut studied a final scroll. It was a death rite, one not practiced in centuries, forbidden after the reign of a forgotten king who had once tried to split the temple from the court. It had been buried in archives, meant to vanish, but the high priest had found it. He traced the ink with his finger. The rite spoke of cutting the thread of legacy. It required not the death of a body, but the erasure of a name, the complete removal of a pharaoh's memory from all record, all history, as though he had never ruled, as though he had never lived. It was a cruel magic, fed not by gods, but by silence. And User-en-Mut, facing the twilight of his influence, began to prepare it. He would not kill Nebmaat. He would make the world forget he ever was. The sun over Thebes dimmed behind a curtain of desert dust, casting the city in an amber hush that felt neither day nor night. It was a time between a fragile hour caught in the space where endings and beginnings held hands, unsure of which would step forward first. In this suspended moment, the wheels of power turned slowly, but with grave intent. Within the temple of Amun, beneath the carved ceiling of stars and over the sacred floor that had echoed with generations of royal footsteps, High Priest User-en-Mut prepared for a rite that had not been spoken aloud in over 400 years. The scroll before him had been transcribed by his own hand, a careful replica of the original, now hidden again in the depths of the archives. The ink was fresh, the symbols ancient. It contained the language of forgetting, a curse not of death, but of erasure. A spell that, once spoken in full, would condemn the memory of its subject to vanish from official record, from temple inscription, from public chant and sacred calendar. To the world, they would become nothing. User-en-Mut believed it necessary. He told himself this again and again as he traced the glyphs. Nebmaat had become more than a ruler. He had become a story, and stories, once rooted in the hearts of people, were more enduring than kingship. The priests could challenge power, they could dispute bloodlines, even cast doubt upon law, but they could not fight memory, not while it breathed in the mouths of children, in the daily acts of healing, sharing, learning, unless it was severed. The rite of erasure required 3 days of preparation. No sleep, no food. The high priest, once tall and proud, now bent at the shoulders from age and ambition, moved like a shadow within the temple's hollow centre. Incense filled the halls in unnatural measure. Bells ceased. The outer sanctum was closed. A black curtain veiled the image of Amun. No one was permitted to ask why. Outside the temple walls, life stirred on with unease. Amini had grown suspicious. The scribes she once traded stories with had begun to avoid her gaze. A favoured messenger, loyal since her first appointment, vanished without notice. And in the markets, murmurs swelled that the high priest had enacted an ancient rite, though no one dared say its name. When the rumour reached Nebmaat, he did not rage. He simply asked, "Is there a record of this rite?" Ameni replied, "Not in the public scrolls, but the archives hold older truths." So they went, not to the royal library, but to a chamber below the foundation of the school itself. There, beneath the walls still blackened by fire, were shelves of orphaned scrolls. Cast-offs from the temple, written by hands long silenced. By torchlight they searched, and there it was. Tucked inside a reed basket sealed in wax, the rite of dust. The text was faded, brittle with age, but its meaning was clear. It did not kill, it did not exile, it did not even wound. It merely stole remembrance. A name once erased by the rite would be removed from temple record, divine calendar and sacred lineage. Songs would cease to include it, rituals would pass it by. Statues would be chiselled smooth, tombs left unnamed. Nebmaat read it in silence, then folded the scroll gently and passed it back to Emeni. "They are afraid," he said. "Afraid of your death?" "No," he said softly. "Afraid of my life." And so he began to prepare not for battle, but for legacy. If they sought to erase his name, he would leave it written in places they could never reach. He ordered the teachers to write stories, poems, songs, not about kings but about kindness. About a man who built a school, who walked among the sick, who gave grain to those forgotten. He told them, "Do not name me, let the deeds belong to the people." In the grain jars sent to distant villages, he had small strips of linen wrapped around the stoppers, each marked with a single symbol. A sun over water flanked by 2 reeds. No name, just a mark, a whisper to remember. In the healing house, he carved a small tablet with his own hands, depicting a man kneeling beside a sick child. No inscription, no royal seal, only an image set into the wall behind the garden pond. He visited the school in secret, told the children a story of a falcon who forgot how to fly, but learned instead to walk, and in doing so saw the world more clearly than any bird in the sky. The children laughed, unaware that they were being given a memory that would outlive monuments. But even as he planted seeds of remembrance, the temple completed its preparations. At sunset on the 3rd day, User-Enmut donned the ceremonial shroud of the rite. Black linen, layered in folds covering all but his eyes. The Council of Sanctity stood in formation. A low hum filled the sanctum, vibrating beneath the stone as though the very temple breathed with it. The altar was cleared. The sacred names of pharaohs past were read aloud, then one by one, the name of Nebmaat was omitted. The erasure had begun. Word reached the palace that night. A single lantern was raised at the temple's highest tower, the sign that the rite had entered its final phase. Nebmaat stood at the edge of his balcony, the city below lit with scattered flames from oil lamps still burning in window after window. He did not descend. He simply stood in the night air, the linen of his robe curling gently in the breeze. Behind him, the chamber was quiet. No guards, no scribes. Only Emeni remained, watching the back of the pharaoh she had come to serve not with duty, but with belief. "Will it work?" she asked softly. He turned slightly, and for a moment the moonlight caught the shadow beneath his eyes. "It might," he said, "but only if we let them write the ending." And then he stepped inside, picked up the final scroll, a letter. Not of protest, not of power, just words, written plainly for no one and everyone. "If I am forgotten, let my people remember themselves." And with that, he pressed his seal to the parchment, not the royal mark, the lotus and eye, the symbol of witness. The morning that followed was oddly bright. The Nile shimmered like polished glass, its surface untouched by wind or reed. Birds sang in the high palms, oblivious to the silent struggle unfolding across the city they had always called home. Thebes had awoken into stillness, not of peace but of poised breath. The temple bells did not ring, the sanctuary of Amun remained sealed. No chants echoed, no priests emerged. Only the great black curtain that had shrouded the idol for 3 nights now hung limp in the heat, heavy with the weight of secrets spoken in the dark. Within the palace, the halls were nearly empty. Most courtiers had retreated to distant villas. Many claimed illness or urgent family rites in far provinces. Those who remained walked slowly, their voices hushed as if words alone might summon misfortune. Nebmaat sat beneath the fig tree. He was not alone. Amani stood nearby, a sealed bundle of scrolls cradled in her arms. These were his final writings, not decrees, not commands, but reflections. Thoughts set down without the pretense of rulership. In them he had recorded not what he was, but what he had hoped to be. He looked tired, but not broken. He had eaten little in days. His robes hung more loosely now. His skin, once kissed by the sun, had paled beneath the shadows of doubt and dust. And yet, in his eyes, there burned a light that would not flicker. "They'll announce it today," Amani said softly. He nodded. "There will be no burial rites, no mourning, no mention of your name. They will call it a correction of record." "I know," he replied. "What do we do?" He looked up at the tree, at its branches thick with green, its trunk solid and kind. "We let it happen." She frowned, stepping closer. "Majesty." "No," he said gently. "Not majesty. Not anymore." He reached out and took the scrolls from her hands, set them carefully into a small wooden chest lined with linen. Upon it he placed a single stone, the same heart-shaped piece the child had once given him, now worn smooth with time. "I am only one story," he said, "but stories do not die when the name fades. They die when no one tells them." He looked at her. "Will you tell it?" Her eyes stung, but she nodded. Outside the palace gates, a procession had begun. Priests in white and gold, drummers without rhythm, no musicians, no incense, only a long march of silence toward the central square. At their head walked Nebmaat, his face hidden behind a veil, his staff held high. The crowd gathered but did not cheer. They watched with the eyes of witnesses, not worshippers. Some held children close, others stood with hands clasped as if in prayer, though no god was named. In the square a podium had been raised. Upon it sat a new scroll, blank save for one sentence. The name Nebmaat shall no longer be spoken in temple, in rite, or in record. Nebmaat stepped forward. He did not chant. He did not raise his arms. He simply spoke. "The divine order has been restored," and then he burned the scroll. A torch dipped in oil touched its corner. Flames swallowed the parchment quickly. Ash rose into the air, caught in the breeze, vanishing upward toward the indifferent sky. But the people did not move. They remained in place, watching, waiting, breathing. And then, without cue, someone lit a small lamp. Just one, then another and another. Within minutes, the entire square glowed with points of flickering light, in windows, in hands, atop stone walls and crates and steps. No chanting, no protest, just fire, just memory. From the palace balcony, Amani watched with her hand over her mouth. Beside her, the chest remained closed. But the stone atop it seemed to warm in the light that reached even there. Nebmaat stood behind her, no longer dressed in the symbols of rule. His linen was plain, his sandals worn, but his back was straight, his breath even. He looked out over the city and smiled. "They tried to take my name," he said, "but I gave it away long ago." And with that he turned and descended the steps of the palace, not into exile nor death, but into the streets of his people, nameless, free, walking once more as he had at the beginning, barefoot, quiet and alive. They did not call his name. They did not need to. They remembered.